NATO this evening standing by its commitment to supply Ukraine with weapons and other aid, but reminding that its obligation to the beleaguered non-NATO nation only goes so far. This evening, I sat down with NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. I'd like to get your response to President Zelensky's remarks today. He said NATO has yet to demonstrate its ability to save people. Do you think that was an appropriate, a fair remark?
I think all NATO allies listened very carefully to President Zelensky, and we admire his courage and political strength in the way he stands up against the invading Russian forces. NATO allies are providing significant support to Ukraine and their armed forces with advanced air defense systems, with anti-tank weapons and ammunition, fuel and many other types of support.
Not the things he's been asking for in terms of a no-fly zone, in terms of tanks, in terms of fighter aircraft.
Again, we are providing a lot of different types of weapons.
The idea of a peacekeeping force has been rejected by this body for fear of igniting a war between NATO and Russia. And this is a difficult question for me to ask, but is there a point in which war becomes necessary, that it's worth to take the risk because of the level of the atrocities?
NATO has one core responsibility, and that is to protect and defend 1 billion people living in 30 allied countries. We do that by sending a very clear message to Moscow that an attack on one ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance. But of course, our responsibility is to then both support Ukraine, but at the same time prevent an escalation of this conflict to become a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia.
You and President Biden have expressed concern about the use of chemical weapons by the Russians. Do you rule out a military response if there is a use of chemical weapons?
As President Biden has stated several times, any use of chemical weapons will have severe consequences. It is absolutely unacceptable. It will be a blatant violation of international law, and it will have severe consequences.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.